So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Samawada Network. We're really excited to have this panel today on environmental justice. My name is Nura. You've probably seen me before. I'm calling in from Durham, North Carolina, and I wanted to introduce our brilliant panelists to you. So I'm going to ask y'all to introduce yourself, where you're from, what work you do, and tell us what does environment mean to you? What's your personal connection? I think that would be like a really great way to get access into this work for you. So I would love to start with Michelle, and then.
Sure. My name is Michelle Gafar. I am an environmental attorney. I work at Earth Justice in San Francisco. I'm from the Bay Area, so happy to be here, although never happy about the super high rent and $5 coffee that is common to San Francisco. And I think so environment to me, includes all the natural things that we're surrounded by on the planet, but also the circumstances and other sort of structural conditions that impact the communities that we're within. And so I think environment definitely includes community.
Sure. Salam everyone. My name is Masooma Khan. I'm a vice president at my student union at Dalhousie University, and I'm studying international development studies and history. That's a double major. I do a lot of work with grassroots folks, specifically Indigenous people in the territory I'm from, which is Mi'kmaq territory. I'm a settler here, and for me, what environment means to me as an Afghan who is essentially a byproduct of British colonialism and imperialism, and through displacement, finding myself on this land, environment to me really centers an Indigenous focus. So for me as an Afghan settler, my duty is to stay true to the treaties of the place where I'm at, and to be here to recognize that water is life, and to do my job as a settler and do the duties to Indigenous people across Turtle Island.
And Masooma, that's in for the Americans on the call, from U.S. folks, that's in Nova Scotia,
Yeah. So I'm in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Very cool. Thank you.
Awesome. I am Ghazal. I am from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. I am currently a city planner for the city of San Francisco. Part of my time is focused on working on our city's sea level rise adaptation plan for the eastern and western shorelines, but I also work on development projects, transportation projects. So it's actually kind of this weird dynamic and tension between development, but then also preservation. And I guess through this dichotomy, environment can mean so much to me. It means the natural environment, but also means the built environment. And I think the interplay between the two are very important to recognize. But more generally, the environment means to me sustenance, it means resistance, it means persistence too. So that's how I come to understand environment in my work and my role at my job, and then just also as a human being on this planet.
That's incredible. Yeah, my connection is this is really cheesy, but my mother is obsessed with recycling to the point where the fight my mother and father have is about composting. And so my connection is sort of my mom's concern for what happens, so much of how she even talks about Afghanistan as khak, the soil of Afghanistan is what she misses. And sort of that's my entry point to understanding it. I'm not an expert like you three, so my intention in the conversation is to sort of poke and prod when you all offer your insights to sort of connect the conversation. And so I'm excited to sort of do that. So one of the questions I really wanted to start off is, we say environment, but then the call's topic is environmental justice. So I wanted to ask, maybe we could start with Ghazal and continue, what is environmental justice, and how does this differ for environmentalism? Because with both words, I just hear environment. So I think it does unpacking, like, what is the difference between environmental justice and environmentalism?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question and so important to tease out because I think even in our own TSN chats, this has come up. Like someone was talking about environmentalism, someone else talking about environmental justice. So to actually put it out there, the actual definition is environmentalism is kind of like a social movement dedicated to environmental integrity and preservation, whereas environmental justice is a social movement that's dedicated to an equal distribution of environmental goods and decision making and resources. So it's never just concerned about the wilderness, and I think that's where people kind of get it confused. Is like you care about environmental justice, you just want to run around and play on the sand, which like I do still, but it's a little bit more than that. And just many times these causes are conflated and you would think they'd be natural allies, but they can be as different as black and white, literally and figuratively. And just for like a brief history, since at least the early 1900s, the environmental justice movement has criticized the mainstream environments movements, racism and classism, which oftentimes you could really see in just pure environmentalism. There's a level of white supremacy to it. And to some extent, it echoes the ideas of like wilderness being an invention of rich white European and American men, which excluded women, other classes, and caused genocidal destruction upon indigenous populations. So there's this like deep history of environmentalism and wilderness that's kind of that kind of goes against what environmental justice is. So I think it's very important to tease out the two, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so EJ is where communities of color usually are organizing, and that's the space it speaks to, it seems, that conversation. Interesting. Do you all have thoughts on that, Michelle and Masuma?
I mean, the way I kind of see environmentalism is like, those vegan hippies that are really concerned with people eating meat and then, really like villainizing indigenous populations and other racialized populations for the tactic they kind of take. I kind of see them as those people that are more into getting rid of those plastic straws and actively tackling pipelines. You know what I mean? And then environmental justice, I see as more of a grassroots movement. For me, at least, where I'm at in Mi'kmaq territory, environmental justice is very indigenous focused and indigenous led. There's no environmental justice without indigenous people being at the forefront of conversations, especially because, we do actively benefit from their land as settlers. Even though, we've been displaced due to colonial violence, we're still, actively benefiting off of their lands and seeking safety in their land. So for me, environmental justice is about equitable, I think, access to justice in different communities when it comes to the environment, right? When we talk about water is life, specifically in the Canadian context, there's over 172 Indigenous communities that don't have access to clean drinking water. And the Canadian government during Canada 150 was spending millions of dollars on fireworks when they could have literally stopped this from happening and actually served Indigenous communities. So for me, I see the Canadian government sort of going into this environmentalism, sort of very neoliberal politic, and then you have environmental justice happening at the ground level.
Do you notice, what are some misunderstandings about AJ work that you notice in the community, and especially in our community conversations? Is it that people just don't know what the term means? Or Michelle, when you describe your work to your family or cousins, are they what's that? What are their thoughts when you're this is the space that my professional career is built in?
Yeah, I constantly get made fun of in my family for the work that I do, and I'm also a vegetarian, so the amount of making fun of that happens about me and my work is pretty day to day. But I think it goes to what the other folks were saying. It's just really recognizing the difference in the impact that some environmental policies and projects have on communities, where I don't think strict environmentalism really always recognizes that. I mean, at least in the legal context, pure environmental law is very much so focused on using specific environmental statutes to protect like public lands, certain species, wildlife, that kind of thing, without really looking at like the impacts on surrounding communities, whereas environmental justice uses a completely different set of civil rights laws to try to remedy the impacts of environmental racism and like the impacts of certain like oil and gas or other really terrible projects on surrounding communities, because by and large really terrible projects happen to have like disproportionate burdens on people of color and communities of color, and traditional environmental law really doesn't properly address or remedy that, but in using environmental justice laws like civil rights laws, that is a way to go about remedying some of those impacts.
So you use civil rights laws for environmental work then? So is there like specific subsets of laws that are written about the environment in that corpus of work then versus like how does that I don't know the law well.
Yeah, so we actually use both. Earth Justice is really traditionally like an environmental law nonprofit, so by and large we use these environmental statutes like the National Environmental Policy Act or the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, and we primarily bring those types of cases, but there's also a sub-body of work that tries to work with civil rights laws like the Title VI section of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to like specifically go after projects that are cited in communities where they're going to be disproportionately impacting primarily people of color that live around these places. I mean, if you look at where like oil refineries and a lot of like warehouses and other things are located, those projects by and large end up being cited in communities of color or where like there are a lot of really poor people, and that's not by accident. And so these civil rights cases try to go after that specifically.
That's awesome. You guys have probably sued some of the projects I've worked on. Like, I'm serious. Like, all the brownfields and all the stuff in Mission Bay and all that stuff. I mean, it's a huge, it's a big issue. So it's good to have that check and balance outside of what, even though it's like the government who wrote the laws or, legislators that wrote the laws, it's at the end of the day, you rely on like a nonprofit to enforce them.
Mm-hmm.
Are there misconceptions about environmental justice within our community? Like, I'm sure it's like, oh, these are the vegan hippies, right? But like EJ work is so interconnected with communities of color. Like, I wonder what our families think. So I was curious. That's what I'm curious. Is like sort of this is really fundamental work that's being done that affects the communities that live in these areas. So I don't know if that's something you wanted to draw out more on.
Yeah, I mean, are you asking me or anything?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna go. So it's interesting because as an Afghan, when you start talking about environmental justice, people think you're talking about like straws, like make sure you bring your metal straw everywhere and make sure you ride your bike, not realizing that so much has been done to avoid this unintersectional approach to environmentalism. So much has been done to keep people of color away from actual to just avoid that, intersectionality and environmentalism. So, which is why I think when we talk about environmental justice in these spaces, it's so important because protecting the environment is actually not a novel concept for Afghans. Like in Afghanistan, our economic welfare is tied to the land. It's tied to the health of the land, and there's become a certain point that as a diaspora we've become disconnected from it, and maybe it is our migration patterns or resettlement patterns, but we have become disconnected from it, and it's been reframed as this like white drive your Prius thing, which if you drive a Prius it's fine, you're still saving the environment, but that's just not all it is. So I think reintroducing these concepts back into our spaces and realizing how they're interconnected to virtually every single other issue we care about, we can kind of get at the root of the problem. But it just needs to start from somewhere, I guess.
Yeah, I think that there's like sorry. Sorry. Do you want to go ahead?
You guys are so polite. Let's go.
I think that there's just an inherent disconnect in the Afghan community from indigenous communities and other historic communities of color. Speaking from my context, I haven't met any Afghans in the community here in Halifax that actively have developed relationships with indigenous people or other black historic communities such as the African Nova Scotian community, which has really been hit by a lot of environmental racism, right? And I think there's a disconnect into the way that we're accessing this conversation because we're really exposed to this very white-centric school system where they're really giving us a sort of facade on, recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle, right? Everyone remembers that, but when it comes to actively showing up when pipelines are coming in, there's a total disconnect because folks are like, that's not my issue, that's their issue. I'm not an indigenous person, that's not about me, right? So I think there's a disconnect in how we're really looking at our collective liberation as people and our collective safety as people and our collective environmental justice as people.
I agree with everything that's been said. I think that, at least speaking personally about my own family, I think that the sort of different perspective of environmental justice has not really trickled down to Afghan people, at least my family. I think it's really mixed up in this concept of it's recycling and, metal straws and all of that. And I think part of it is because we're, as a group, more recent immigrants to the U.S. And I think other communities that have been here, always or much longer, Native American people and Black and Latino people in the U.S. I think have been very much so actively involved in the environmental justice space and environmental justice legal work, whereas it's not something that I think we're as aware of as a group, even though at its base it just recognizes that a lot of environmental harms disproportionately impact people of color, and just seeing where Afghan people in my community, where they've tended to live, the kind of health issues they've tended to have. I mean, a lot of that is really connected to the really terrible refineries or warehouses that are located near where they live.
Exactly. And so that relates to this question we got from Idris Jalili online. What is environmental justice, which you sort of explained, and why is it relevant to Afghans here in America who are just struggling to make a living from their fried chicken shop? And fried chicken shops are common in New York. And I can sort of chime in and give y'all a moment. Actually, I realized in talking to y'all, my first job out of college was at a labor union, and we worked with port workers that were mainly Eritrean, Ethiopian on the East Coast. And so it was a blue-green collar collaboration where basically they're port workers that work these shipping industries, like you were saying, Michelle. And what was happening was that they were being disparately impacted. Their health was suffering a lot because of what they were being exposed to in these port industry areas as port workers. And they weren't being unionized because they were brown workers at the rate that the white port workers would be. So it was very much a labor issue. So why does it matter for the fried chicken shop worker? Because in New York, Afghans also work ports. So your Afghan kaka, your Afghan baba, your mom that's working on these ports, your health is being detrimentally impacted. So the profits from those areas, from these port industries, are going into the hands of other folks, but the negative impact in terms of health, which was my entry point into the conversation, is happening to your uncle, your dad, those folks that are trying to make the minimum wage, taking these jobs because they're newly arrived immigrants. So that's my reflection point, but I'm curious if y'all have thoughts on that. And thank you, Idris, for the question.
Yeah, I also think I'm noticing a lot of Afghans, recent refugees from Afghanistan are resettling in areas in California where are primary people of color, which is great. But then there's also in areas where pollution levels are toxic, former brownfields or places with very limited sewer infrastructure. And these are places that the government is placing them, as their, arrival into America, into the Bay Area. Mm-hmm. So this is a very concerted effort of placing people of color in Afghans, recent Afghans, into areas that are toxic, and that's environmental racism, to bring up another term. Mm-hmm. So it's very relevant to us, and I just think it's really important to think of the interplay of the different jobs we do and the different industries we're in, and how they're all related to the environment, and how what we do can become weaponized against us, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, speaking to there's a lot of Afghans in California that live in Fremont, for example, and a lot of my relatives live in Fremont and Newark area, and that's an area where there's a lot of large companies, like specifically companies that make cleaning products, were responsible for spewing industrial waste into the soil for years and years, and so that's impacting all the people that live in those areas. A lot of my family also live in the Central Valley in California, where there's just terrible air quality because of all the pollution from various factories and agricultural practices in that area. And so it goes so much so much more beyond straws or whatever, to these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what it really just made me think about, hearing what you both just said, was just the way that our bodies are viewed as being disposable. We can take on all this harm, all of this, to just keep feeding into this capitalist beast that's taking advantage of our parents, our family members, their bodies, their well-being, their mind, their spirits, their souls, only to have them deal with environmental racism and die from it, and that cycle just continue, right? So I'm just, now my head's what are we going to do to break it?
Yeah. What are we gonna do?
I gotta do something, fam.
Well, I mean, how do we make this a point that? I asked this question on Facebook the other day because I was what does environment translate to in Farsi? And I didn't know the Dari Pashto Farsi word for environment, which shows to me that I don't talk about this I talk about it with my mom and my dad, but I don't talk about it at Mimoni's. And so, is there a space to bring this up to folks that doesn't seem tacky or so left field, here comes the hippie talking about EJ work? How do we make these conversations relevant to in Afghan community spaces?
Well, I think we can really connect it to the current state of Afghanistan and what it's going through, right? With all this resource extraction and our resources being taken advantage of, and how we're going about it. And I think Afghans should understand what's happening in their lands is also actively happening here too, right? And just the diaspora forces us in this sphere. So I feel I don't know how it could be tacky, right? We have 12 years left on this planet. I don't know how that's tacky. I think that's serious stuff, right? So if I'm at a Memani and I'm telling you, yo fam, we only got 12 years to live, this is some serious stuff we gotta talk about. I don't know if that's tacky or if you'd see me as a hippie, but at the same time, I feel this is a conversation about community care, right? Because really what we're fighting for is our existence. In our existence as Afghan people from time. So I think that's what I think about it.
I also find because climate change and environmental justice and environmental racism is tied to literally everything, it's very easy to bring up a topic not directly related to what people quote unquote think is hippie, and show them that it's actually something they care about. I talk a lot about working on sea level rise along the western shoreline. You have a lot of rich communities who have homes on the western shoreline all throughout California. Mm-hmm. So sea level rise is imminent, right? Our worst predictions are actually becoming our average predictions at this point. And that's really, really frightening. So you want to appeal to people, you appeal to them through land use, you appeal to them through transportation, You appeal to them through, how you locate resources. These are, you appeal to doctors through public health, like, assuming they care about public health, but like, this is like, they're ways. It's tied to, I believe it's tied to literally everything. It's tied to tech. It's tied to, you name it, you can find a connection. And I think in finding what people are passionate about and teasing that out, you can find an environmental cause related to that. And not everyone needs to pick up a metal straw, but if they can find a way to plug into their work and into things that they care about, then they're doing their part. I really believe that they're doing their part.
Can you, so breaking down how much this like affects communities, like we had notes beforehand, and one of the things that was noted was food deserts. I'm kind of curious how food deserts plays into this, because that's my entry point into Afghans will fight about food. If I post about food on Facebook, I will get 40 comments from Afghans about food. Like I say I like Arab food as much as Afghan food, and I have gotten kicked out of group chats. So like, what is a food? So in thinking about, like food is such a key part of the hospitality in our culture. So what are food deserts? Like, how does it affect us? That might be like one entry point in, and thinking about tangibly how was.
Tackle that.
Go ahead.
Michelle? I can go, but Michelle.
I haven't worked, I don't have a ton of familiarity around like food deserts specifically, but it's not something that's like hard to see when you really start looking in terms of like what it means. I mean, you go into some communities and like they have corner stores or like grocery stores that don't have like fresh foods or vegetables, and it's mostly like processed foods. And then, at least in San Francisco, there's like a farmer's market on every corner, and like you look at the sort of people that live in both of those areas and the wealth concentrated in those areas, and I feel like in a nutshell that kind of describes like what a food desert is and how it plays out in terms of like impacting the health of people living in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, not having access to fresh food and triggers a lot of like public health concerns, which are then, the statistics and data for public health in poor communities and communities of color are then used against communities of color. So it's just this like, feedback cycle. You don't have like fresh food and vegetables and all that for, public health reasons. And then it contributes to like public health disparities and ensuring these statistics are used against them. And then people don't want to locate there. It affects property values. Like, you can find so many connections, so many layers of connections, from food deserts to land use to city planning to gentrification to everything. What happens in a city that's about to be, where people are about to be displaced, will have a Whole Foods come in, right? So there's a lot of interplay with food deserts in terms of like a planning issue, a climate change issue, actually, and then like an environmental justice issue. And Afghans love food, so are you going to go to Whole Foods and buy your food, or where are you going to go to the Afghan market? And then at the same time, things like liquor stores and like these small Afghan markets are also seen as like these horrible things, but these are places where people can afford property and businesses, and this is what they can provide, so it's so interesting how environmental justice, environmental racism also plays a role in like displacement. And
our word of the day: intersections, folks. Intersections.
Everything's connected. So we have 2 questions from online. So I'm going to say one and then have us talk about it and then share the other one. So this one is from Hewat John Ayub. Are lawsuits against companies who excessively pollute in the realm of the pursuit of environmental justice? If so, many Afghans have been understanding and can still understand this. Why is this straightforward concept above or too complex for the Afghan diaspora? And it's on the side of the chat that we have in the video, if you all want to look at it. So, so lawsuits against companies who pollute, does that count as EJ work?
I would say so. Yeah. So like, one of the actual like straight environmental justice lawsuits that my organization has brought in the last like couple of years is against the Port of Oakland, because there are all these like people of color living around the port, and there's like terrible air quality there compared to other parts of the Bay Area. Like people are like 10 times or something more likely there to have cancer than other parts of the Bay Area. Um, and we sued under like the Title 6 of the Civil Rights Act of '64, because the port and the city of Oakland were just continuing to like expand industrial like freight activities at the port with like no awareness or no sense of like trying to mitigate the environmental impacts of like that expansion on surrounding communities. And so I think that there are lawsuits like that, at least like just locally in like Oakland. So there's that one. But I don't see like Afghan involvement in those types of things. Like it's traditionally I see Black and other brown people involved, and really like active in trying to push for those types of things. I've never heard of like an Afghan community pushing to sue a company or some other polluter for their impact on, public lands or their community.
Okay. So second question is, does anyone else want to chime in before I ask the other question? Okay. This question is from Hadia Amoni. Is there any research on rates of asthma onset in Afghan refugees after immigration to the U.S. versus in Afghanistan?
I'm not a public health professional, so I'm not sure I can answer.
I'm not aware either, but I can tell you bronchitis and asthma has run in my family for generations. So I don't know if like certain like folks within the Afghan diaspora are more like susceptible to those kinds of things, but I know in my family it's definitely been a thing that's been ongoing for years.
Yeah, a lot of my family members have asthma, and that's something that like no one had when they were in Afghanistan, or like cancer specifically is not something that people had like in Afghanistan, but they come here and after 10, 15 years of living here, people are getting cancer and asthma. But I think this is like a real gap in research. A lot of research like doesn't really look specifically at like people of color or like not beyond like Black and Latino populations, and so it's just like a huge gap in understanding how some of these things impact Afghan people specifically, especially because we're a relatively like smaller immigrant population in the U.S.
Excellent. So I would say if there are any aspiring researchers in the audience, we've just thrown them some pressing questions to ask. Excellent. Okay. So that kind of gets into this conversation we're having, like, of impact of climate change. Because, Michelle, I was really struck by, I didn't know there were so many soil and cleaning companies in Fremont, Newark. Like, I'm thinking about how much time I spend there in the summers. And so, do they employ Afghans? Or, like, what is the interplay of, like, the communities to these corporations that live there in terms of...
Well, I mean, the fact that they're located in like Newark versus like other parts of, Fremont is pretty indicative of something in and of itself, right? Because it's like there's a lot more people of color that live in Newark. And yeah, this was something that I think like played out more in the 90s, before like these companies sort of like moved, because I think it became really obvious at some point that like they were literally like dramatically polluting the soil in that area. And yeah, that's at least in my family, like where my brother's asthma started was like in that area of Fremont. So, yeah, I feel like these things are a lot more personal than we think, like when we really start to think about some of these impacts, like within our own families.
It'll be interesting because isn't like Facebook planning on moving to Newark? So it'd be interesting to see if they start cleaning up in preparation of their new neighbors, so to speak.
Yeah.
The question on Facebook also gets into the question of class and race. So, like, how is this also about equity in race and class? Some of these words like equity, like I feel like it took me years to understand what equity was. So could we break down what equity means before we get into like the intersection of equity with race and class, only because I feel like I know it so much from being within these spaces, but like to someone who experience, a lot of people experience this rather than like intellectualizing, and they feel it before they think it, right? So what is it? What does that material feeling look like? Like, what do we mean when we mean equity, and how does this interplay of race and class come into it?
I have a good metaphor for that. So I was trying to explain this to students the other day. So imagine I tell you I got 3 cheese sandwiches. Okay, one for all of you, right? But one of you is gluten free, one of you is dairy free, and the other one of you can have all these things. Now I say I have 3 cheese sandwiches. I'm gonna be equal and give you all 1 cheese sandwich, but 2 of you can't eat them, right? So when we talk about equity, I'm going to say, oh, but actually one of you is allergic to lactose, dairy. So I'm going to make sure that it's a peanut butter sandwich. And for one of you, you're gluten free. So I'm going to make sure I use gluten free bread and put the dairy in there. So now we all have sandwiches that fit our needs. And that's what equity means, right? So when we're talking about our race, our class, and equity, it literally means based on the context of our intersections of identities. For me, as an Afghan Muslim woman with an invisible disability, what does it mean for me to navigate the world in a lower socioeconomic income, right? Very different than someone who has a lot of privilege, isn't visibly Muslim, doesn't have a disability. We're living very different experiences of life, right? So when it comes into, I guess, environmental justice, we're talking about folks who don't have access to education, who are often being forced into these kinds of jobs that's putting their bodies on the line for these big like corporations that are just taking advantage of their labor at no cost, right? Because to these capitalist industries, our bodies mean nothing, right? We just provide the product. I hope that was.
I love that. I love the sound. I think that really, really does help because I spend so much time thinking about it theoretically that I don't know if I know how to like break it down in a tangible way. And because people gripe about it, they're like, "Well, why does that person's need look different than mine? Because your histories and things into that are different, right? So we have to sort of like honor that."
Yeah, echoing what John was saying, I think equality is just an equal distribution of resources, and equity is just giving people what they need to, so that things like race, class aren't a barrier to their success. Race, class, caste, structure, their history, structural existence is not a barrier to their success. And I also think what's also important to think about when we're talking about environmental racism and classism and race, it's not as, we don't necessarily see, smell, and taste environmental issues like we used to during the times when the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and stuff were passed. The environmental racism is more insidious now. It's more hidden, and I think it's been done intentionally so that we don't get involved. So when we start thinking about how can we get involved in these issues, then we have to be a little bit more intentional about where we can plug in. And that's where I think you can plug in when you realize how what you're doing is tied to the land and the environment. And I do that myself as a city planner working on development projects where, how do I reconcile the fact that I do care about the environment, I do care about land, with the fact that, a tower is being built, on indigenous land. So it's just being very cognizant of reconciling that, but also thinking critically about how the issues you care about are tied to the environment. I think it's important to call out indigenous people and voices, knowing who land you're on. I think John's like, on top of that. But a lot of
Yeah.
when we go to national parks, when we think about wilderness, when we think about these types of issues, and knowing like how they're rooted in environmental racism or environmental justice is super important. And if you're awesome like Michelle John, you can work for become an environmental attorney. I mean, you're doing the good fight. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like equity, the way that I've always thought about it is just like giving people meaningful opportunities that really reflect like their life and their histories. And I also think about it in terms of like inclusiveness. So making sure that like the people who are on the front lines of like whatever issue you're trying to address, like reflect the communities that are bearing the disproportionate impacts of that problem. I mean, I think this is like, we've been talking about this, for the last 40 minutes, but basically just like the environmental movement has this whole huge problem of not having people doing that work who are like reflective of the people bearing like the most brunt of the burdens associated with like environmental harm. It's something that a lot of environmental legal organizations are constantly grappling with, because you have a lot of these like Prius driving metal straw vegetarians like working at these organizations, and they're really passionate people who really care and feel like, and know that like the stake of our planet is on the line, but they are not reflective of the people who are actually dealing with like the burdens of these problems. And that is a huge problem within the space, and something that like I think a lot of these organizations are just now starting to like contend with, and trying to hire and recruit people that really reflect like the communities that they're trying to represent.
If I may chime in here, I just wanted to say that I think it's really important to recognize that Indigenous people across Turtle Island, in the North American and South American context, have been leading environmental justice before we even got here, right? This whole, resistance to colonialism has been a fight for environmental justice, has been a fight for their land. And I think what's really important to understand here is that Indigenous ideologies and understandings of and knowledges around land have been so oversimplified by Eurocentric ideologies that they dehumanize them. They demean these understandings and these ontologies to oversimplify them and say, oh, there's those Indigenous people or Native folks who aren't as civilized as us. Look at them. They're busy with the environment while we're trying to build houses and do all this stuff, right? But it really was the Indigenous people that were protecting the lands they were on for so long. And had this practice continued and had genocide not happened, I think we'd be living in a very different world. And so I think it's really important to also center that context that Indigenous people have been doing this from the get-go, and the only way that we're really going to be able to address this is if we, as Afghans, like get into that. Like we need to start building relationships with Indigenous people as settlers. Otherwise, we're just constantly going to be continuing this cycle.
So this leads to my question of, it seems like you three are examples of work Afghans are already doing in these spaces. So one of my questions is, are there more folks like you? Are there more Afghans doing environmental work? I want to uplift that and then think about in that spirit. Weiss Hamid asked, what are ways we can inspire and empower Afghan youth regarding this issue? So I think I'm kind of answering Weiss's question by saying that you three inspire me because you're all in spaces doing this work. Actions speak louder than words. So are there other Afghans? And to Masuma's point, we need more of it, right? But the fact that you are all three in there, to me, suggests that there is some movement into these spaces. I think Ghazal and I share like a mentor in the Sultan Latif. Like, so he's going to be so embarrassed that we're going to give him a shout out, but he does a lot of work. I think Ghazal, you actually know his work in this area. I think of him and I think engineer, environment, check. But I think you probably have a better understanding of his professional expertise than I do. But there is more than you three, just based on my like really rough understanding. But are there others doing this work? Can you share like what those conversations look like in terms of like other Afghans or immigrants that have similar experiences to us doing this work. And can we use that as an entry point to think about how we empower youth to do more work like this?
That's a rough one.
Yeah.
He's saying, mashallah, you guys are doing amazing work, because I feel like women don't like often acknowledge the power they hold. This was also not meant to be an all-women panel, and I'm so proud that it is an all-women panel. Like this, so to me, just the fact that these are Afghan women at the forefront is like just intersectionality by action. Like you're all out there on the front lines doing this in different ways, and that to me is a powerful statement in and of itself.
Yeah. I think if anyone is doing this work, they should reach out because I think there's strength in numbers, and it's good for us to know what other people are doing and in what spaces they're doing it. I think Sultan's definitely one of them. I'm going to shout him out again because he's actually helped me a lot with the exposure to, environmental engineering and all that kind of thing. He does a lot of work on water. I'm totally not going to attempt to explain his work because I think it'll be doing injustice. So Sultan Latif is definitely someone who's in this space. Other than that, I mean, I don't know. I don't work with any Afghans, so it's really rough. It's really rough, but it's that's why it's so exciting to have this conversation and to have it all women. I mean, just it's powerful and it's uplifting, and I'm feeling good despite the fact that I'm working on sea level rise. It feels good.
Yeah, for sure. I think are there more Afghans like you? I mean, I was pretty shocked to find TSN. I was like, what? There's a whole network out here of Afghans that think like me. I think just being in where I'm at in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq territory, just so separated, right? And for me, when I found other like critical Afghans who are engaging in conversations around anti-racism and social justice, I was really excited to connect with them. But all of them are in America. So for me, when I'm on the front lines, like doing this work with the Mi'kmaq community here, in doing projects like Stop Alton Gas, I encourage everyone to look into that. Stop Alton Gas. I'm the only Muslim person that's there. I'm the only visible Muslim person that's there, and I'm also the only Afghan person that's there. I understand everyone's out, in their khana, like, enjoying their mantu and shit, but like I'm on the front line doing this stuff, putting my body on the line, and it would be really great to meet and know that there's other Afghans that are with me, because I feel like that's the part, like, that would just grow the movement so much. If we could, like, get into the Afghan community, coming out to things when the indigenous community is calling us out, when things are actually happening. If we could get Muslims to show up, like why are we so disconnected from this as even people who, if you do practice Islam, like, why are we so disconnected from this when this is literally part of Islam too? So I just, for me, there's just so many things that we'd have to do, but I really think it is a necessity that we call out our community and call them in, because we're not going to be able to do any of this without them. Because I'm tired. I don't know about y'all, but I'm really tired of doing this alone all the time and feeling very lonely. So this has also been a very great experience for me, because I'm like, holy crap, like, I'm not alone, and that means a lot. Yeah.
Michelle, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't see any other Afghans like anywhere I go, in any of the meetings, any of the workspaces, just nowhere. And I think that that's like more also just a reflection of like the legal space. I mean, at least in California, like 85% of the lawyers are white. And so I think that that is obviously really going to impact. Actually, that's not California, that's the US. Yeah, 85% of lawyers across the US are white. And so I think if you really like factor that in, you're not really going to see, or yeah, like the hopefulness around potentially seeing like an Afghan person in these space. Like, I keep my expectations very low, and unfortunately it just hasn't happened. And I've definitely worked with Afghans in like public interest work generally, but when it comes to like law and also the environmental work, like it's just not really a thing. And I think, you know, just really encouraging, at least like in terms of the question about like how to get youth more excited, like really encouraging them to just look around them, like look where you live, look at like the health problems within your family and within your communities. Like this is something that like intersects with every other like major social problem. I was doing like criminal justice reform work before this, and you would be like shocked at how much like that really overlaps with environmental justice work, just in terms of where like prisons and jails tend to be located, like the communities where inmates tend to come from in the first place, the communities they go back to when they re-enter, like after being released. I mean, everything is connected to that. And so, yeah, whether that's like showing up to things or just getting involved more in these organizations that are doing that work, you know, it's unfortunately like really like white, and so it's going to be like a struggle, but I think like having our voices as part of this work is like really important. And just like, yeah, being able to look and see like, oh wow, there's someone else here like me who's like interested in this and doing this work is like very empowering, and like makes you really happy when it does happen.
It does. It really does.
I actually thought, Mr. when you were talking, there's this org in DC called DC Green Muslims. I don't know if they're around, but when I was living in Washington, DC, and Ramadan, they had these initiatives where you would bring in your own plate and cup to the iftar. And then it was this way of sort of thinking about resource, so making Ramadan about resource, like thinking about the resources we use. But then there was also, it was an iftar, and then after the iftar, they would actually have like reflection circles thinking about questions around EJ work. So I don't know if they're still around. If anyone watching is part of DC Green Muslims, I left DC like 8 years ago, 10 years ago, a long, long time ago. But back when I was living there, so they're small, but hopefully, like I'm hoping like conversations like this in the social media sphere connect folks that are doing that work, because it is important to hear. I did not know, Michelle, that 85% of attorneys are white. I think I'm going to start encouraging people to go to law school now, because I used to not. I don't know if this is the same in Canada. But, and then the plug that's totally gauche, that there's this other org that Ghazal and I work with and collaborate with called the Afghan Diaspora for Equity and Progress. And I mentioned that because of Masuma, what you were saying about Indigenous community collaboration. We had Indigenous activists in Southern California come to a leadership training we did. And her discourse was really around understanding the fact that we have this institute in Irvine, California, and thinking about the land we were on, who occupied it, and some of the conversations there. And so I mentioned these to just sort of highlight that hopefully this is my glass half full. I'm an optimist. Hopefully this is like a movement for the future. You three women are leading the path for Afghans in America doing this work. And I say America broadly, North America, U.S., Canada. So
Thank you.
Do you have any thoughts before I wrap up? Like any last reflections you wanted to share with the audience before we close out for the evening?
Go ahead, someone go. I'll go.
I'll go real quick. I just think, because I'm like, it's getting dark here and I'm like going to be lost in the night soon. Basically, I think a lot of this can be very, it seems like a lot, like when you think about like environmental justice, but also about environmentalism and where the planet's going and sea level rise, and can get really depressing really quickly. But I think there's a necessity to talk about these things and really involve yourself. I think incremental approaches to like learning how to adapt to the environment, it's very, very important. I think we should all seek out that. I think it's very important to be flexible when you're thinking about approaches to environmentalism and environmental justice. And I think we should, lead with communities color always, because they're the ones who are disproportionately impacted by environmental concerns. So just want to end with that before it gets even.
Well, thank you so much. The conversation will continue online. We're on Twitter or Facebook. So if you have questions, feel free to tweet at us or continue on Facebook. And hopefully we will continue to have more conversations like this.
Can I say one last thing before we go? Is that okay?
Yeah.
I think for me, if we can leave off, if I can encourage any Afghan youth or any Afghans in general, I think it's really important after we're having this conversation and talking about, centering Indigenous people. I think when we center that, I'm really talking about building relationships of solidarity. Because when things happen to us as Afghan people, we expect people to come out, show up, give us love and stuff like that. But we really also do have to give back. We can't be expecting if we're not also going to be the ones that show up and do this kind of work. So I just want to leave people off with the message of solidarity across communities. And I pray and I hope that everyone that's listening really recognizes how all of our liberation as Afghan people are directly connected to the liberation of Indigenous people, to the liberation of Black folks, to the liberation of trans, queer, 2S, QT, BIPOC folks. Like, it's really important that we center those conversations. So that's where I wanted to leave off for my last message before we bounce, if that's okay.
Michelle,
I just want to say, there's so many different ways that, one can get involved in this work. It doesn't have to be, I feel bad for, using this example constantly, but, just the metal straws or whatever, that's really important, too. By the way, plastic straws are, a major problem, so I'm not trying to, undercut that.
But not for people with disabilities, right?
Exactly.
So, right.
Yeah, right. There are just so many ways to get involved with this work, and it intersects with everything. And so, yeah, that is a source of at least hope for me. But in the future, I will see more people of color and Afghan people in these spaces.
Thank you so much again. And my Reza and Omar, my co-TS centers, has said make sure I plug Instagram. So I'm going to plug our Instagram is more exciting than our Twitter handle. And this conversation will be transitioned into a podcast. We have a podcast series now. So for folks who do commute, who want to listen to that, we sometimes have some of these conversations on our podcast, and we have original content on our podcast. We have a new podcast dropping this week that has to do with gender sexuality negotiations amongst the Afghan diaspora with recently turned professor from the University of Minnesota, Qais, Dr. Qais, and I'm forgetting Qais's last name. But anyway, so content. Thank you again. I think that your examples speak volumes. It's been a privilege being a part of this conversation, and hopefully more to come. Shaba Khosh.
Thank you.
Thank you.